shattered skies and silent shores. The plane bucked violently, metal groaning under the strain. Oxygen masks dangled uselessly, their cords swaying like dead vines as chaos filled the cabin. Passengers screamed, clutching at one another as the world outside the windows turned into a hellish swirl of black clouds and streaking lightning. In the middle of the chaos sat Ava, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests of her seat. She fought to steady her breathing, but each jolt of turbulence made her heart pound harder. The emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that turned panicked faces into ghostly masks. This can't be how it ends, she thought, her eyes darting toward the window. Through the storm, a glimpse of something unnatural, a flash of jagged rock rising from an endless sea. The intercom crackled. "Brace for impact." The pilot's voice was distorted, barely audible over the storm's roar. Time seemed to slow. Ava felt the plane tilt sharply, the world tilting with it. The impact came like a thunderclap, an unrelenting scream of tearing metal and shattering glass. The last thing Ava saw before everything went black was the ocean rushing up to meet her. When Ava opened her eyes, the world was quiet. Too quiet. Her body ached as she pushed herself upright, the taste of salt and blood sharp on her tongue. Around her, the wreckage of the plane was scattered across a narrow, rocky beach. Waves lapped at the twisted remains of fuselage, dragging fragments into the turquoise water. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky streaked with pink and gold. Ava blinked, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The island loomed ahead, its jungle dense and foreboding. Black cliffs jutted out over the shoreline, their surfaces jagged and uneven, like the teeth of some ancient beast. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and something floral, though the sweetness did little to mask the faint coppery tang of blood. "Hello," she called, her voice hoarse. No response. She stumbled toward the wreckage, scanning for survivors. A child's shoe lay half-buried in the sand. Nearby, a scarf fluttered in the breeze, caught on a jagged piece of metal. But there were no voices. No movement. Just her. The first sign that something was wrong, besides the obvious absence of survivors, was the mark. She noticed it as she sifted through the wreckage, searching for supplies. It was faint at first, a thin line running along the inside of her forearm. At first, she thought it was a scratch, but it didn't sting or bleed. Instead, it pulsed faintly, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. She tried to rub it away, but the mark only grew brighter, its lines forming a strange, intricate pattern. Panic bubbled in her chest. Was it some kind of injury from the crash? Radiation? Before she could think further, a sound broke the silence. A low, rhythmic drumming echoed from the jungle. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Her first instinct was to retreat, but the mark on her arm pulsed harder, as if responding to the sound. Against her better judgment, she took a step toward the jungle. The drums grew louder. The jungle swallowed her whole. The beach, with its wreckage and wide-open sky, seemed distant now, replaced by towering trees and a thick canopy that blotted out the sunlight. Vines hung like snakes, and the air was humid, each breath feeling like a struggle. But the drums led her on, each beat resonating in her chest. She stumbled upon the first clearing after what felt like hours. In its center stood a structure, a crude altar of blackened stone, its surface etched with symbols that matched the mark on her arm. Ava hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But the pulsing in her arm was relentless, driving her forward. She reached out to touch the altar, and the moment her fingers made contact, the symbols flared to life. A vision slammed into her mind, images of the plane, the storm, the crash. But it wasn't random. The images were guided, directed. She saw the island as it must have been centuries ago, a vibrant place of worship and power. Then she saw the destruction, waves crashing against its shores, dragging entire temples into the sea. And finally she saw herself, standing in the center of it all, the mark on her arm glowing like fire. The vision ended abruptly, leaving her gasping for air. When she opened her eyes, the jungle was silent. The drums had stopped. Ava stumbled back to the beach, her mind racing. The mark, the vision, the unnatural pull she felt, None of it made sense. The island was more than just land. It was alive, and it had chosen her. But for what? As she reached the shoreline, she noticed something strange. The wreckage had shifted, the pieces rearranged into a crude pattern that mimicked the altar's markings. Ava stared, the weight of realization crashing down on her. She wasn't just a survivor. She was part of something far bigger and far more dangerous. The crash site was fading into the distance, swallowed by the thick wall of greenery. Ava moved cautiously, each step crunching against the damp jungle floor. Her hand brushed aside hanging vines, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The silence was oppressive. Not a single bird call or insect hum broke the stillness. It was as if the island itself held its breath, waiting for her next move. She clutched the makeshift spear she'd fashioned from a jagged piece of metal and a length of wood scavenged from the wreck. It wasn't much, but it offered a small sense of control over the fear gnawing at her insides. That strange mark on her forearm had dulled its glow since leaving the altar, but it still felt warm to the touch, like embers beneath her skin. She had tried to ignore it, focusing instead on survival, food, water, shelter. But something about the island wouldn't let her forget. The jungle wasn't natural. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks, the exhaustion and dehydration creating illusions. The trees seemed too tall, their trunks twisting in unnatural spirals. Roots jutted out at odd angles, like claws reaching to ensnare her feet. Even the leaves shimmered faintly, as though they were coated in a fine layer of luminescent dust. But then came the whispers. Soft at first, just faint murmurs carried on the breeze. She froze mid-step, gripping her spear tightly. The sound seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound firm. The whispers stopped. Something moved in the corner of her vision, a flicker of shadow darting between the trees. Ava's heart hammered in her chest. She turned, scanning the underbrush. "Who's there?" No answer. The jungle responded instead. A branch snapped in the distance, followed by a low rustling, like dry leaves dragging across stone. Ava didn't wait to see what it was. She bolted, crashing through the foliage. The spear scratched her leg as she ran, but she didn't care. She just needed to get away. She stopped when her lungs burned, collapsing against the trunk of a massive tree. Sweat dripped from her forehead, and her hands shook as she tried to steady her breathing. Then she saw it. On the ground, partially obscured by leaves, lay a shoe. It was caked in mud, the fabric frayed and torn. A child's shoe. Ava's stomach churned as she approached. Beside it, she found more items: a crushed water bottle, a tattered backpack, and further on, a scrap of fabric snagged on a low branch. These weren't her belongings, nor had they come from her part of the plain. Someone else had been here. Her relief was short-lived. Further up the path, a skeleton rested against the base of a tree. It was slumped over, its ribcage jutting out like jagged teeth. In one bony hand, it clutched a notebook, the pages yellowed and curling with age. Ava hesitated. She'd avoided looking too closely at the remains. It felt intrusive, disrespectful. But the notebook seemed important. Her fingers trembled as she pried it free from the skeletal grip. The cover was cracked leather, embossed with a name she couldn't make out. She flipped it open, the pages filled with a hurried scrawl. The entries were fragmented, but they painted a chilling picture. The island isn't right. Time moves strangely here, hours feel like days, but the sun never sets. The jungle watches. I can feel it. Something hunts at night. I hear it in the trees. I tried to build a fire, but it only seemed to draw it closer. I found carvings near the cliffs. They glow in the dark. They look like the mark on my arm. I think the island put it there. Ava's breath caught as she read that last line. Her eyes darted to her own arm, the mark now a dull, pulsing blue. The final entry sent a chill through her veins. There is no escape. The island doesn't let you leave. It needs us. I'm sorry, whoever finds this. Run while you can. A sharp snap brought her attention back to the jungle. The whispers returned, louder now. They seemed to swirl around her, overlapping voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. The mark on her arm flared, its light piercing through the trees like a beacon. And then she saw it. A shadow emerged from the jungle, too large to be human. It moved with an unnatural grace, its form shifting as it passed through the light. It was humanoid, but only barely. Its elongated limbs bent in ways that made her stomach turn, and its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the same light as the carvings. The creature tilted its head, as if studying her. Ava's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The mark burned fiercely, and she felt an overwhelming urge to move toward the creature instead of away. It took a single step forward, and that was enough to break her paralysis. She turned and sprinted into the jungle, her only thought to put as much distance between herself and the thing as possible. The whispers chased her, growing louder with each step. When she finally stopped, her legs gave out beneath her. She landed hard, her breath ragged. The whispers had faded, but she didn't feel safe. She looked around, realizing she'd stumbled into another clearing. At its center was another altar, identical to the first. But this one wasn't abandoned. Carvings surrounded it, their glow pulsing in time with her mark. A low hum filled the air, resonating in her chest. As she approached, she saw something new, a basin carved into the stone, its surface filled with a dark, viscous liquid. Her mark pulsed again, and she felt the compulsion return, stronger this time. The whispers returned, one voice rising above the rest. "Drink." Ava stared at the liquid, her reflection rippling on its surface. The island wasn't just alive. It was waiting for her to act. Ava's pulse quickened, matching the rhythm of the low hum resonating from the altar. The dark liquid in the basin shimmered faintly, its surface alive with shifting patterns. Her reflection warped with each ripple, distorted into something that wasn't quite human. "Drink," the voice urged again, louder this time, with a sharp edge that made her grip the edge of the altar for balance. She shook her head, willing herself to resist. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. The word felt pitifully weak in the face of the command. The mark on her arm burned, sending sharp jolts of pain up to her shoulder. Ava staggered back, clutching her arm, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The jungle around her seemed to respond. Branches creaked, vines coiled tighter around tree trunks, and the faint glow of carvings on the surrounding stones brightened. The island was alive, and it was angry. The ground beneath her trembled suddenly, a low rumble that grew into a violent quake. Ava stumbled, barely catching herself before the earth split open in the center of the clearing. From the chasm emerged a blinding light, casting sharp shadows that danced wildly across the jungle. The air grew thick with an acrid, metallic scent, and the hum from the altar turned into a deafening roar. Ava scrambled backward, her heart pounding. As the light dimmed, the outline of an opening became clear, an entrance carved into the earth, its edges lined with glowing symbols identical to the ones on her arm. She didn't want to go near it. Every instinct told her to run. But the mark pulsed again, a painful tug that left her breathless. It wasn't giving her a choice. The descent was steep, the steps uneven and slick with moss. Ava gripped the walls for support, her fingers brushing against carvings that hummed faintly under her touch. The air grew colder with each step, carrying the faint sound of water dripping in the distance. As she reached the bottom, she found herself in a cavernous chamber. The walls glowed faintly, the same swirling patterns etched into every surface. In the center of the room stood a massive structure, a pulsing, organic mass that seemed to be part stone, part living tissue. Veins of light ran through it, branching out into the walls like the roots of a tree. Ava approached cautiously, her steps echoing in the stillness. The mark on her arm grew unbearably hot, its glow bright enough to illuminate the path before her. The closer she got, the more she felt it, a presence. It wasn't just the island, it was something older, deeper, and far more powerful. A sudden movement made her freeze. From the shadows emerged the creature she had seen earlier, its grotesque form illuminated by the chamber's eerie glow. Its elongated limbs moved with a disturbing fluidity, and its glowing eyes locked onto her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The creature didn't attack. Instead, it circled her slowly, its gaze flicking between her and the pulsing mass at the chamber's center. Ava tightened her grip on the spear, though she doubted it would do much against something so monstrous. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice echoing in the cavern. The creature didn't respond, but the mark on her arm did. A wave of searing pain brought her to her knees, and suddenly her mind was flooded with images. She saw the islands past in fragmented visions. A civilization once thrived here, its people devoted to the entity at the island's core. They built temples and performed rituals, offering their lifeblood to keep the island alive. In return, it protected them, granting their land unnatural fertility and power. But their greed grew. They demanded more from the entity than it was willing to give. The rituals became darker, the sacrifices more brutal. Eventually, the island turned on them, consuming its people and sealing itself away from the world. The visions shifted. Ava saw ships crashing against jagged rocks, their crews disappearing into the jungle. She saw travelers like herself wandering the island, marked and drawn toward its core. None escaped. The final image was of her, standing in this chamber, the mark on her arm blazing as the island's veins wrapped around her body. The vision ended, leaving Ava gasping for air. The creature was still there, watching her intently. She looked at the pulsing mass, understanding now what it wanted. The island wasn't just alive, it was starving. The glowing veins were its lifeblood, and the mark was a tether, binding her to its will. It wanted her to give in, to let it consume her as it had consumed so many others. Ava forced herself to her feet, the spear shaking in her hand. "No," she said again, stronger this time. The chamber seemed to react to her defiance. The pulsing light intensified, and the air grew thick with a suffocating pressure. The creature let out a guttural snarl, lunging toward her. Ava swung the spear instinctively, its jagged tip catching the creature's shoulder. It howled, its form flickering like a dying flame. She didn't wait to see if it would recover. Ava turned and ran, the glow of the mark lighting her way as she scrambled back up the stairs. When she emerged into the jungle, the quake had subsided, but the island felt more hostile than ever. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches reaching like claws. She collapsed near the altar, her chest heaving. The mark on her arm had dimmed, but its heat lingered, a constant reminder of what she'd seen. The island wasn't just a prison. It was a predator, and Ava was its prey. But something had changed. The creature had hesitated when she struck it, its form faltering as though it wasn't invincible. For the first time since the crash, a spark of hope ignited within her. If the island could be wounded, maybe it could be defeated. The heart of the island. Ava crouched behind a massive tree, her breath shallow, her ears straining for any sound beyond the rustle of leaves. The jungle wasn't silent anymore. It was alive with movement, creatures scuttling through the underbrush, branches swaying though there was no wind. The island was restless, and it wanted her back in its grasp. She clutched the spear tighter, her knuckles white. Her mind raced, replaying the vision of the glowing veins branching out from the pulsing mass in the cavern. She wasn't sure if it was instinct, desperation, or madness guiding her thoughts, but she knew one thing. The island had a heart, and she had to destroy it. The mark on her arm throbbed faintly, its light now a deep, ominous red. It wasn't just a brand, it was a link to the island, and she suspected it worked both ways. If the island could reach her, maybe she could use it to find her way back to the cavern. The jungle resisted her every step. Vines snaked across her path, tripping her as she moved. Roots jutted out from the ground like traps, their sharp edges slicing into her boots. The whispers returned, louder and more persistent, like an army of unseen voices trying to drown out her thoughts. "Turn back. You can't win. You are ours." Ava gritted her teeth, pressing forward. "Not anymore," she muttered, her voice hoarse. The mark burned again, brighter this time, and she felt a pull, not physical, but an overwhelming sense of direction. The island was guiding her, but whether it was leading her to its heart or into a trap, she couldn't say. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The jungle thinned, the dense foliage giving way to a barren expanse of jagged rocks and scorched earth. In the distance, she saw it, the entrance to the cavern, its edges glowing faintly. The sight filled her with both dread and determination. A sudden rustle behind her made her spin, spear at the ready. The creature was back. It emerged from the shadows, its grotesque form hunched but no less menacing. Its glowing eyes locked onto her, and a guttural growl rumbled from its throat. Ava didn't wait for it to strike. She charged, her spear aimed at its center mass. The creature dodged with unnatural speed, its elongated limbs swiping at her with razor-sharp claws. The fight was chaotic, a blur of movement and pain. The creature's strength was overwhelming, but Ava's desperation fueled her. She ducked under a swipe, driving her spear into its side. The creature let out a screech, its form flickering like before. It lunged again, but Ava was ready. She rolled to the side, grabbing a jagged rock and hurling it at the creature's head. The impact staggered it, giving her just enough time to make a break for the cavern. The descent felt different this time. The air was heavier, the glow of the carvings more intense. Ava's mark pulsed in sync with the veins, each throb sending a wave of nausea through her body. The cavern was just as she remembered, vast and otherworldly. The pulsing mass at its center seemed larger, more alive. The glowing veins that spread from it now pulsed faster, as if anticipating her arrival. She approached cautiously, her eyes darting to the shadows, expecting the creature to reappear at any moment. The mark burned fiercely, and a voice boomed in her mind. "You cannot destroy me." Ava clenched her jaw. "We'll see about that." She circled the mass, searching for a weakness. The veins pulsed rhythmically, their light blinding up close. Her spear felt pitifully inadequate against something so immense. The voice returned, sharper now. "You are mine, Ava. Accept it. Surrender, and I will spare you the pain." "No!" she shouted, driving the spear into one of the glowing veins. The reaction was immediate. The cavern trembled violently, and the light of the vein flickered before dimming. A guttural roar echoed through the chamber, the sound reverberating in her bones. The mass began to shift, its surface rippling as though it were alive. Ava's triumph was short-lived. The creature burst into the chamber, its glowing eyes blazing with fury. It moved faster than before, its claws slicing through the air with deadly precision. Ava dodged, narrowly avoiding a swipe that would have torn her apart. She scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. The spear was still embedded in the vein, and she had no time to retrieve it. The creature lunged again, and this time Ava couldn't evade it. Its claws raked across her shoulder, and she cried out in pain. But then she noticed something. The creature hesitated. Its glowing eyes flicked toward the dimmed vein, its movements growing sluggish. Ava's mind clicked into place. The creature was tied to the island's heart. Weakening it weakened the creature. She bolted toward another vein, grabbing a jagged shard of stone along the way. The creature roared, but its movements were slower now, giving her just enough time to slash at the next vein. The light dimmed, and the roar turned into a guttural scream. The chamber began to collapse, chunks of stone falling from the ceiling. The pulsing mass writhed, its light flickering erratically. Ava stumbled toward the remaining veins, each strike taking more out of her than the last. Her vision blurred, her strength fading, but she refused to stop. The final vein was the largest, its light blinding. She raised the shard, her arm trembling. The creature lunged one last time, but its form was barely holding together, its body flickering like a dying flame. With a scream, Ava drove the shard into the vein. The mass let out a deafening roar, its light exploding outward in a blinding flash. The cavern shook violently, and Ava was thrown to the ground. When she opened her eyes, the mass was gone. The glowing veins had dimmed to nothing, and the cavern was silent. The creature lay motionless, its form dissolving into ash. Ava staggered to her feet, her body battered and bruised. The mark on her arm was gone, leaving only a faint scar. She climbed out of the cavern, emerging into a jungle that was eerily still. The oppressive presence was gone, replaced by an almost peaceful silence. The island was free, and so was she. For the first time since the crash, Ava felt hope. She didn't know how she would survive or if rescue would ever come, but she had beaten the island, and that was enough for now.